5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, my name is Timothy Phillips. I am the founder of the Information Security Leadership Forum, and I also have today the privilege of being the facilitator of this first session of our ISO 27001 webinar series. So thank you very much for taking the time to come and join us for this session. I think you're going to really enjoy this. So during this session, we're going to be talking about a number of different topics. We're going to start with an overview of the standard. We're going to go through a little intro of some of the key 27001 family documents. We're going to touch on the tenets of information security, the history of the standard. We're going to talk a little bit about the strategic business value and residual benefits that you'll get from implementing ISO 27001. We'll talk about its business focus that's mandated within the standard. And then we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Something that comes along with no matter which standard or framework that you're working with. You'll have some of each of these. And then we're going to wrap it up at the end. We're going to talk a little bit the time and cost required to implement. This is a very key topical area. It's one that will come up by the leadership of every organization that is starting to have those discussions internally as to whether or not we implement ISO 27001. Leadership and the board want to know how much time are we going to dedicate resources to this initiative and what is the cost. So we're going to talk about some of the challenges with having that conversation. So now we're going to take a quick snapshot of what the standard looks like. You'll see it in the image on the right-hand side of the screen here. It's really broken down into three key sections. Starts with clauses 1 to 3. And essentially, these are administrative information as it relates to the document itself. It really doesn't get into any of the controls that a practitioner will have to implement within an organization. That all starts in the next one, which is clauses 4 to 10. Clauses 4 to 10 is commonly referred to as management controls. It's key to note that the controls within clauses 4 to 10 are mandatory and you must implement them for any organization that is looking to declare conformance to the standard, and especially if you're going to the next step to get certified. Annex A is commonly referred to as the technical controls. While we say that, there is a bit of overlap between technical and management topics. And this is further broken down into 4 categories: organizational, people, physical, and technology controls. And within those 4 categories, ISO has defined 93 different controls that you must implement in order to meet the requirements of Annex A. Important to note, as it relates to Annex A, these controls are a list of requirements. However, as it relates to Annex A controls, if they are not applicable to the scope of the information security management system that you're implementing, your organization does have the ability and the opportunity to document a business case, which, if you're going for certification, will be reviewed by the certification auditors. So you can't just say we're not going to do that control because it costs too much money, and quite frankly, we don't want to spend the time or money on it. That is probably not going to fly with a certification auditor. The next one we're going to talk about is a couple of key documents within the 27000 family. It starts with the ISO 27001 standard. This is the main one that organizations seek to get certified to. Just below and to the left, you'll see ISO 27000. That actually is a document number, and it relates to a document which is considered or referred to as a vocabulary or glossary of terms. Below that, on the left, you'll see ISO 27002. That document's been around with 27,000 since inception with ISO, uh, and 27,002 is an implementation guide. Now, so just so I should qualify what ISO means by a guide. A guide is something that will tell you for this particular control, and everything under 27,002 is applicable to Annex A controls only. And so the guide will say to meet the expectations of this particular control, you might do this, this, or this. So it'll give you some ideas. It does not prescribe a set of activities that you go do this, do this, do this, and then once you've done that, you will comply. It doesn't give you a prescriptive means on how to implement. It gives you more of a guide of if you do this, you might be in compliance with that control. On the other side, on the right, 27,003, this is the implementation guide, and it focuses on clauses 4 to 10, the management controls. If we go back over 27,002 on the left and go down, you'll see 27,017. Essentially, this is how would you implement these controls. It's another guide. How would you implement these controls if it related to a cloud computing environment, cloud services environment? So maybe you have a service provider that has a SaaS, that kind of thing. Key to note the difference, one of the structural differences between 27,002 and 27,017, where 27,017 is a cloud services guide, that the 17 document breaks it down to what the cloud services customer needs to know and do, and what the cloud services provider needs to know and do as it relates to complying with particular controls. And it works very well in tandem with 27,002. And on the right-hand side of 27,017, you'll find 27,018. And this is another guide on how ISO expects you to do as it relates to protecting personally identifiable information, or PII. So we talked a little bit earlier that we're gonna hit on tenets for information security. So the standard does require that information security be applied as it relates to ensuring for and provisioning for the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data and the information systems upon which they reside, traverse, or require as part of a general control for their protection. On this slide, we're looking at a bit of the history of ISO 27001. At any time, you can put your video on pause and kind of walk around this. It starts at the 1 o'clock position and works its way around from the right over to the left and all the way back up to the 12 o'clock position. So what you'll see here is essentially back in 1990, under the number 1 step here, that's really where it all started. And a branch of the UK government said, wow, a lot of things are going on. We see the internet, the proliferation of the internet really starting. We're going to have to get our arms around this and start to build some kind of guidance for what should an organization do to have a security program, because as soon as we start expanding the perimeters of our network, we really need to make sure that security is really done well. So between that and at the 2 o'clock position, 1993, that's where they got together with some other public and private sector organizations and developed a draft. And then in 1993, it was handed back over to the UK agency, and it was put into the standards building, review, and approval process, and in 1995 finally published. Then if we go over to the number 5, that's where you'll see in the year 2000, ISO first adopted what was called British Standard 7799 or BS 7799, and when they adopted it, they, in order to help people that had a bit of experience using it make that transition, they called it ISO 17799. And then and that was considered edition 1 of ISO 17799. 2005 came out with edition 2, and there was a huge amount of changes to the standard between the 05 or edition 1 and edition 2. And then later on, and this was in the springtime of 2005, in the fall, ISO had converted that document into a specific ISO numbering scheme, and that's when it became ISO 27001 and would be considered edition 1 under that numbering scheme. Then as things progressed, you see at 2013 was the next edition of the 27001 standard, and also what you see was the 27002 was also was published in its second edition. First edition came out in 2008, and then most recently the 2022 version of both 27001 and 27002 were then published. So that gives you kind of the a roundabout history of the standard. So now we're going to touch a little bit on the strategic business value of implementing the standard. And it really starts with, it provides a secure, retain customer confidence. And where this might even be more germane to you is if your organization had a recent data breach that was public knowledge and communicated to your customers. One of the things you're going to have to do is kind of step up and do something to show that you're serious, or even without a data breach, because you want to be proactive, you want to show your customers that you mean business, is you go ahead and implement that, and it'll help to quickly transition them and secure those customers. And for any existing customers that you have, it'll help you retain their customer confidence. The next is to establish a competitive market differentiator. So if you're in a market and your competitors aren't ISO 27001 certified, being the first to market and getting certified in your market will absolutely create that market differentiator that will set you apart. A lot of organizations that I've seen over the years have used this to really, really help them kind of catapult forward during RFP processes when putting bids in for customer contracts. Once you're already in that position, you've got certified, your competitors say, oh my gosh, we're missing out on a lot of the RFPs, and they're going over to company A because they're ISO 27001 certified. Hey, let's get on board, let's do that. So they do that, and now in order for you to stay competitive, you have to maintain that ISO 27000 certification, because now everybody's kind of doing that. The next is compliance with customer contractual obligations. So a lot of customers have embedded contractual obligations either for regulations or standard. Because ISO 27001 is recognized and adopted in 167 countries around the world, it has become the de facto standard that organizations will embed in their contractual obligations, that their service providers become and get certified as ISO 27001 compliant. There may be regulatory compliance and demonstrate organizational due diligence. So residual benefits, so increased resilience to cyber attacks and disasters. You're probably asking, how does doing a standard really change that? Well, consider maybe you're not doing a full and robust security program, but now you're putting in the full depth and breadth of what ISO 27000 requires in clauses 4 to 10 and Annex A. and you've implemented, let's say, a number of controls above and beyond what you were doing before. Now, I think it's fairly easy for an intelligent person to then make the leap that you're going to be a little more resilient to cyber attacks when they come at you with those controls in place. Next one is ensure security supports the organization's business strategy and ensure a foundation to secure the organization's sensitive information assets in all its forms, whether it's in digital format, whether it's in print, or whether it's being verbally spoken. The ISO standard addresses, no matter how data is used or conveyed, to make sure that security is considered in all those realms, and provides a centralized managed framework to coordinate all information security efforts, including related regulatory requirements. For this reason, it's been kind of given that quasi name as an umbrella framework. One of the requirements of the 27001 standards mandates that you must do a legal and regulatory review and incorporate any data protection requirements, whether it's regulatory or legal, such as your merchant contracts as an e-commerce merchant that says you have to comply with PCI DSS, or whether it goes into other areas such as HIPAA or NERC or any other regulation that you're legally obligated to comply with. The standard says you must bring those in, and therefore you're able to kind of pull it all together in an umbrella. I've seen many organizations which were looking at potentially 5 or 6 different regulatory obligations and then managing each one of those as a separate security program. The ISO 27001 allows you to bring it in, and you can still do individual reporting, but it pulls it all together nicely for you. Also offers an organization-wide protection, enhances an organization's ability to be aware of and respond to evolving security threats, creates opportunities for reduced cost associated with information security through centralization, even if that centralization is through just the oversight and management of the program, and focuses on the protection of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We talked about those. Those came from our tenets of security. And it helps to create a security-aware culture across the organization. So on the business focus, assign specific accountabilities for the organization's leadership for oversight of the information security management system and establishment of specific information security management objectives aligned with the organization's business strategy, and permits customized parameters for the scope of the ISMS through the defining of management system boundaries that include system, organizational, and geographic. It also mandates input from stakeholders, security leadership to become acclimated to the business operations. So you have a new security officer come in that's running your ISMS. The standard mandates that they know and understand the operations of the business. You can't just come in and say, well, I used to do security that way. I've been doing security for 10 or 20 years. And as it relates to what I know and I do, I did that before and it worked, so I'm doing it here. ISO requires a business focus and understanding the business operations. It also mandates roles and responsibilities defined for all personnel supporting the ISMS. It also requires that you take a risk-based approach. So you're going to do a risk assessment, and any of your deficiencies essentially are going to be prioritized based on those risks. And regulate leadership, formal program review, also awareness and training on critical information security topical areas, technical and non-technical issues, and competency requirements are defined for all personnel supporting the ISMS. Proactive communications on the ISMS are required as well. So now we're going to go into the good and the bad, the ugly. And I'll qualify this by saying, as I go into this, it doesn't matter which standard that you're implementing. There you can find good, bad, and the ugly of each one of those. They're just going to try to kind of breeze over this and kind of give you some insight as it relates to this. So on the good side, it creates trust through transparency. And there is certain documents that are created that will be able to, especially if you're on the customer side and you're aware of these documents, you can specifically mandate those uh, in your customer or your contract with your service provider, and mandate that that is shared with you as well. We talk a whole lot about that and make a lot of recommendations if you are going to participate later on in one of our ISO 27001 lead implementer certification courses. It's a week-long course with both a practical and a written exam on the last day. So we go into these kind of things. It serves as an umbrella framework. We talked a bit about that. Provides a clear structure for a secure foundation for your business operations, and incorporates strong ties to the business strategy, and ensures resources and skills are defined and in place, and incorporates design input from stakeholders, and obligates continuous improvement and growing recognition as a basis from which to demonstrate due diligence expectations. And lastly, requires organizations verify third parties meet or exceed its security posture, ensuring security throughout the supply chain. The bad. So minimum necessary focus can lead one astray. Having said that, ISO requires that here are all the controls that we expect you to have in place, and they don't need you to be looking like you're part of the Department of Defense with the depth and breadth of how perhaps the Department of Defense might implement that control. ISO rather says, here's the control, show us that you've met the basic requirements of that, and if you do that, we'll give you credit for it. That can also lead to, because it's subjective, it can be a bit confusing as to what that minimum necessary might be. And you think you're there, but when certification auditors come in, you'll find out that your interpretation of that control is a little different. For that reason, we always recommend that you use a credible and certified consultancy to make sure that if you haven't implemented this standard in the past, that you're using resources that can help provide that guidance for you. Overlapping requirements between management and technical control areas. Both the standard and guides leave leaders confused on how to implement. To put this into context, just look at it as, what is the standard? A standard is a definition of what you must achieve. It does not prescribe how to get there. Similarly, the guides under ISO, specifically in the 27001 family, don't also guide you on how to implement. They give you guidance as to, for this particular control, if you did this or this or this, that might meet our requirements. So it's just giving you some ideas on how to comply with it. It's not telling you how to get there. So many confuse it as an end state vision versus a basic foundation for a secure operating platform. And I will tell you that it is well known in the industry that there are a number of organizations that have been ISO 27000 certified and maintain that information security management system in conformance with the standard, but have still been hacked. So that can be an oversight or a challenge. So suffice to know, this is implementing the standard and getting certified should by no means be considered. If we do that, we are secured and we'll never ever have to worry about it and never have a problem. You still may. So really key to note is this is a great place to be at, and then start building on the security program and getting it much more robust. So unlike some regulations, the standard fails to recognize the effort required to oversee the ISMS in operations as well, and certification is a revenue-based business. So really what that's saying is, as it relates to certification, it is becoming more and more competitive by the year, and therefore there are certain certifying bodies out there, may be a little more lax than others, and they have established their reputation by that. As a customer of a service provider, that's one of the things I would caution you to look at. Don't just look at the piece of paper that says they're certified and say, check, okay. They meet our requirements of verifying service providers, but you're going to want to look at who the service provider used and then do a little research on their reputation to make sure that you're still comfortable at the end of that. Now, the ugly certification audits rely heavily on internal audit work. So in order to be, this kind of follows on from that last point. In order to be competitive, somehow the certification body has to scale down the amount of or volume of work that it's doing in order to keep the price nice and low in order to be competitive. One of the ways that they do that is they rely heavily on the internal audit work. So you're going to want to make sure that a thorough job is done during that internal audit work that's mandated. Auditing functions lack standardization, defining how audit test procedures are defined and performed from one certification body to the next. So this is an industry challenge that I think one day we're going to have to follow. So when certification body one sends their auditors in, they may test a particular control one way versus another certification body's auditors may test it in a different way. And really, I think it's going to come down to, in the future, there's going to, for appropriateness, be some synchronization of audit test procedures and agreement across all certification bodies. And perhaps that's going to be a role that the information security leadership may play a role in bringing those certification bodies together. Not all certifications are created equal, and I think that's kind of a lead on from what we were just talking about, and sections of the published standard and guide sometimes conflict or fail to align. Like anything else, nothing's perfect, so those kind of things happen. So now we're going to kind of roll into kind of the tail end of this session. We're going to talk about the time and cost to implement. But before we kind of show some of the challenges related to time, we're going to talk about some of the things that will cause a variance between organization A, B, or C. So some of those might be the size of the organization's technology footprint. An organization like a tech startup that has 8 servers is going to be spend less time to become compliant in its systems than an organization with 800 versus an organization with 8,000. So obviously the technology footprint, the size of it, is going to have an effect. Similarly, headcount. So there are a number of personnel security controls. So again, if you have 5 people in the organization, that's going to be very different than 5,000 or 500,000. Outsourced elements. Some organizations outsource nothing. Others outsource everything. Existing expertise, financial resource availability. Maybe you don't have enough budget to do the full implementation. So rather than being able to get it done in under 12 months, you're going to have to amortize this over 1, 2, or 3 years. So you're going to have to do it based on your financial resource availability as well. Volume of controls already deployed. So if you already have 80% of the controls that are mandated under the standard in place, it just stands to reason you're going to get it done just a little bit faster than an organization that only has 20% of them done. and leadership commitment. So that's going to really, really help versus an organization which doesn't have the full commitment of its leaders, and you're going to have to spend some time really getting them on board. Competing priorities such as a new HR system and ERP or other systems that are and big things, big mergers and acquisitions. Those things can compete for the same resources that you're going to need while you're implementing your ISMS. So that could be a factor as well. Contractual obligations. I've seen organizations that sign a contract with a customer and then their timeline is defined by that contract. Controls in place, etc. So now we're going to take a little snapshot view here on setting realistic expectations. I am not going to go through every part of this slide. You can press pause on the video, go through it at your leisure. The key thing that I want you to take away from this slide is really the first two segments are the things that will define and help you qualify how much it's going to take to develop and implement your controls. Remember what I said on the earlier slide, for an organization that has 80% of the controls in place, it's going to take a lot less than an organization with only 20% of the controls. That is all going to be, you're going to get your feel for that and understand that when you finish your gap and impact assessment and the mitigation plan. To learn more about what's involved in that gap and impact assessment and developing your mitigation plan, that's going to be the topic of our next session in this webinar series, so I'm not going to go into detail. We do go into great detail and show you some nice flow charts of some of the activity that's going on there. So we go into a bit more detail, but this is the executive overview, so we're not going to take a deep dive here. What you need to take away from this slide is, until you know what you don't know, there's no way you're going to be able to have a meaningful conversation with leadership to provide a qualified timeline of what it's going to take. What I recommend is the best approach when you're dealing with the leadership and the board is to have the conversation and use something like this to explain why you can't tell them up front what the end-to-end timelines are. But what you might say is, after these first two segments, and these first two segments, we forecast to take X amount of weeks or months. Then I'll be able to come back to this leadership team and be able to have a meaningful conversation, a qualified conversation about what it's going to take. Because during this time, after we do the gap assessment and do our impact, we're going to look at, from a people, process, and technology, what is it going to take to convert those gaps to conformance with all the controls. And that becomes how much time and what goes into our control development implementation. And that's why I can't tell you what the end-to-end is right now. But what I'm asking for is the approval on the initial two phases, and then I'm going to come back to you with qualified data and get your permission as a go, no go forward decision to finish this out. And similarly, as we're looking at cost, we have the same real big challenge. So they're going to want to know, and really that comes down to, where are all these dollars? And the biggest area is right down in the bottom, which is where we've defined on this timeline area, is what is X dollars. Until we know what W dollars are, we've gone through the risk and gap and impact assessment, we won't know until we understand how many people that we're going to need, if we need any, what processes and other defined activities we're going to have to create, and do we need to automate those or have them supported with technology, and what's the technology going to cost, and an ongoing implementation and maintenance cost. So I always recommend, when you get into forecasting your cost, is to show like a 5-year spread. So your initial capital outlay, your expense to put it in place, and then your ongoing run cost after that. So again, This will explain why you can't have that conversation again until after the gap and impact assessment mitigation plan is put together. So that is it for this session. I want to thank you very much for taking the time out of your valuable schedule, and really appreciate that you being here. And I hope to see you in session 2, where we're going to talk about preparing for and conducting your ISMS gap and impact assessment and developing that mitigation plan. Thank you so much, and do hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and look forward to seeing you in the next event.